Good morning, guys. I'm here to tell you that every year, 52,000 Americans contracted a sexually transmitted infection. Half of those individuals were between the ages of 15 and 24. So the point being, right, this is a really common disease, particularly in younger people. And basically, when we look at this, one of the reasons I choose to do this chapter instead of, say, infections of the skin or nervous system or something like that, is actually we find in this chapter, right, these sexually transmitted infections, 4 out of the 10 top infectious diseases in the U.S. are STIs, right? These are the microorganisms that get passed around quite a bit here in the U.S. These diseases do require sexual contact, right? These bacteria, these viruses can't stay alive outside of the body for very long. So this dispels a lot of the myths about what you pick up on public toilet seats and things like that. These do require close contact, sexual contact. We'll see that some of them can get passed to offspring, either across the placenta or during childbirth. And also keep in mind anything that's sexually transmissible that would also be able to be passed, typically through sharing needles. So don't do that. Okay. So let's dive in here. Oh, I did this whole STI. STIs are what we used to call STDs, right? Sexually transmitted diseases. And then our parents' generation actually called these venereal disease. So there's been kind of a progression, a name change, if you will. I think this new, and it is, probably just in the last 5 or 10 years that I've seen them starting to call this STI instead of STD. And I think the idea here is to, I don't know if it's to take some of the stigma away, right? It's not that you have a disease, you just have an infection. Or to point out, right, that a lot of these are extremely treatable, right, infections, to get people to seek help or exactly what's going on there. But people will still know what you mean by STD. But STI is kind of the common language now. Okay, let's dive in and take a look at some. So I should warn you, there are pictures in this PowerPoint, may not be appropriate for children, and some of them are pretty gross, in which case, quick look, know what you need to know, and then, avert your eyes. But yeah, there's some gross pictures in here. Okay, so this is kind of fun. I get to do this over the computer instead of live in front of you guys. So, okay, so the first STI that I want to talk about is syphilis. So Treponema pallidum is the causative organism, and that's the picture here. And this is the shape of this bacteria is what we call spirochete. So remember, we had more shapes than just bacillus. Remember spirillum, different than a spirochete, right? Spirillum is a wavy noodle. Spirochete is like a spring. So anyway, this is a spirochete. Humans are the only host, right? It does not survive long outside of the host. And here we see it actually kind of drilling in, right? Penetrating. This is how it gets into the host. So it gets in by kind of drilling its way through things like skin is typically too keratinized, too tough, but the mucous membranes it can get through. If there's a wound or an abrasion, like razor burn, anything, that makes it easier. And they also often choose hair follicles as a site of a little bit easier entry. So once this little critter here gets inside, it's going to get into the bloodstream, and it's going to be able to spread and grow actually in lots of different tissues. The incubation period averages around 3 weeks, though it can be up to 3 months. And so this has a pretty wide range there. What we're going to see is that syphilis really comes in 3 different stages, progressively kind of worsening. And that if it's treated early on, it's extremely easy to treat. So here we go. Here comes your first gross picture, because in primary syphilis, what we're going to see is what's called a canker. So here are a couple examples of cankers, right? This is apparently painless. I don't know if I believe it, but a painless circular purplish ulcer with a raised margin that has hard edges. Okay, so that is going to, I'm just going to move that picture. This canker, and that's spelled weird, Chancre, canker. This develops at the site of entry, right? So the genitals, rectum, lips, wherever that spirochete found a way in. The canker lasts for up to about 2 months. So it lasts for a month or two, and then it heals spontaneously, right? The immune system comes in and takes care of it. But maybe I shouldn't say it that way. The canker heals, but the spirochetes are now in the blood, the lymph, and have made it into other organs as well. Okay, so then you can move into secondary syphilis, right? So you may have incubated this for a month and then had primary syphilis for a couple months. And now we're looking at secondary syphilis. So what we're going to see here is a fever, flu-like illness, a skin rash, right? So that's this picture here. And that rash can also extend. It's like, you'll find it on the palms, the soles of the feet, the face, the scalp. It's pretty widespread rash. This can lead to things like patchy hair loss. You may see someone with secondary syphilis exhibiting jaundice. That would indicate that the spirochete is damaging the liver. And then the real problem here is this patient can enter a chronic latent state, right? So they might have a flare-up, and then it kind of goes away. But then they might have a flare-up, and really, when they have that relapse, they are infectious. So, tertiary syphilis. Here's another gross picture for you. Tertiary syphilis. So, about 30% of untreated syphilis would progress to tertiary syphilis. Syphilis is treated, right? Like, that canker, that is something people go to the doctor for. Or if you had that body-wide rash, that would probably make you go like, something's not right here, okay? So syphilis is not near the problem, I would say, that it used to be, right, before we had treatments. The treatment's penicillin. Really easily treatable. But untreated, about 30% of cases turn into tertiary syphilis. And this can have many different forms, but what we see is that the spirochete has spread kind of throughout the body, can grow in different places. And in tertiary syphilis, what it forms is called a gumma, Gumma. And this is what you see here on this person's hand. Again, apparently painless. A soft, painless, gummy, non-infectious granular lesion. Gumma. So obviously this is gross looking on their hand, but what's worse is that this can be happening in other parts of the body, right? So a common place is actually in blood vessels. And so a gumma in something like your aorta, right? You can imagine how much weaker that's going to become. And so you have, it's much more common to have aneurysms, right? Just like bursting open a blood vessel as a result. And then obviously if this happens, if a gumma forms in your brain, that's generally considered pretty bad. A lot of people who develop tertiary syphilis go mad. There's definitely a mental component. In fact, I read a book. It was about, it was called Pox, Genius, Madness, and the Mystery of Syphilis. And so it's kind of going through a bunch of people in history that they think had syphilis, and that might explain their strange behavior. So anyway, it can lead to insanity. So best to be avoided. You can also, this can be passed across the placenta and infect the baby. And so this this can cause stillbirth. Okay, so baby going term and then being born not alive. So stillbirth. You see the children kind of born covered with all these sores. And so you can see then, well, the spirochete has managed to spread throughout the baby. And so we see a wide range of effects there. Deafness, impaired vision, poor bone development, meningitis. This picture on the right here is showing how the teeth malform. So there's this characteristic, I don't know why this happens, this characteristic shape of teeth called Hutchinson's teeth, where the teeth are kind of, notice particularly things like the incisors, they're more rounded, more barrel shaped, they're not flat. Anyway, it's probably the least of our worries. Okay. And so the last thing about syphilis before we move on, the diagnosis, right? Often, hopefully, we catch this as primary syphilis. A sample is going to be taken from that canker, and it's not too hard to stain and observe the spirochetes. There are antibody tests. You can do DNA tests, right? So we can catch this. The treatment is super simple, right? It's penicillin. In fact, if you catch this during primary or secondary syphilis, a single dose of penicillin usually nips this one in the bud. So get tested. Okay, gonorrhea. So the Neisseria gonorrhoeae is our bacteria that causes this, that causes the clap, right? So that's a nickname for gonorrhea. That's basically French for the clap is the brothel, right? So the whorehouse is where you would get gonorrhea. And so its nickname reflects that. This is actually the second most frequently reported bacterial disease in the U.S., second only to chlamydia, which we'll talk about next. So gonorrhea, again, very common. This is a small bacteria, so they're pointing out it is a gram-negative diplococcus. So see how it's like this double kind of bean shaped there? And so we've zoomed in even further. So gram-negative diplococcus, again, pretty easy to ID there. It doesn't have a capsule, it's not motile, but what it does have, the fimbriae, it does have fimbriae, which are going to help it attach in the urogenital tract. And it also has an enzyme that breaks down IgA. So remember, immunoglobulin A is an antibody typically found on mucous membranes. And this is one of those virulence factors here where gonorrhea can break that down, right? Sneak past the immune system. The incubation period here is pretty short, 2 to 6 days. And what we're going to see, I'm going to break this down. It differs, a lot of these differ signs and symptoms wise between males and females. And so in females, they're looking for things like a reddened cervix. You can't see your cervix. A doctor can see your cervix, but you can't see your cervix, right? So that would be really hard. Nope, can't do it. So a reddened cervix, discharge, like abnormal discharge, abdominal pain, pain on urination, the menstrual cycle can get interrupted. So, nothing crazy, right? You could miss those kind of symptoms. And in fact, 50% of women who are affected are asymptomatic, right? So they wouldn't even know that they have this. They might spread disease. The real big problem here, and that's what this picture is trying to show, and we'll see this again in quite a few of these STIs, is that if this disease actually if this bacteria spreads up into the fallopian tubes, you develop what's called salpingitis. Itis tells you inflammation. Salpingitis is inflammation of a fallopian tube. This is a form of what they call pelvic inflammatory disease, right? There's a few different things going on there. But really the problem here is as you build up, that inflammation can lead to scarring in the fallopian tube, which can lead to infertility, right? Because if if an egg is released from the ovary and it can't fit through the scar tissue, right, that would be infertility. It also increases the risk of ectopic pregnancy. So if an egg does get through and is fertilized, when it goes to implant, it's much more likely to implant in the fallopian tube, and that can be lethal. They're also pointing out here that this infection can actually move out of the fallopian tube. So this is anatomically, I guess this is important to realize, that the ovary and the fallopian tube aren't really connected. The fallopian tube is right next to the ovary, and when an egg is released, the fimbriae here at the end of the fallopian tube try to pull the egg in, but it really is an open-ended tube out into the peritoneal cavity, out into the abdominal cavity, and so you can also spread disease out there. In males, males tend to have more kind of acute signs and symptoms. Only about 10% of males are asymptomatic here. So things like tingling, pain in the penis, pain on urination, thin, watery discharge, all the way up to like a yellow, thick fluid. And discharge, like when you talk about discharge from the cervix, it's not like that unusual, right? There are things leaving the uterus. Discharge from the penis should catch a male's attention. Also signs and symptoms: frequent urination or feeling like you need to urinate, swollen lymph nodes in the groin, pain in the testicles, and that again is when you have kind of bigger problems here. So pain down in the testicles would indicate that infection has spread, and spread down into something like the ductus deferens here, or maybe even the epididymis, right, where sperm are maturing. And just like in the female, if scar tissue closes off that vas deferens, sperm aren't going to be able to get through, right? This can lead to infertility. So it is worth noting, right? People talk a lot about infertility, I shouldn't say they talk a lot about it, because often people don't talk about it at all, right? But not being able to have children. And we kind of blame that on people being older when they finally decide to have kids. And so next thing you know, you're doing all this like in vitro fertilization and all these different things. Sexually transmitted infections can mess up the reproductive tract and make it so you can't have kids. So it's worth noting, if you're interested in having kids, these would best be avoided, right? And things like condoms obviously offer you some protection, but limiting the number of partners that you have is going to improve your odds of keeping this reproductive tract healthy. Okay, a couple other things that gonorrhea can lead to. So gonococcal pharyngitis, right? So if it's in your throat, gonococcal proctitis in the anus, gonococcal ophthalmia in the eyes. So typically the ophthalmia, this is going to occur in babies that are born to women who have gonorrhea. And so babies at birth, right, in the hospital are given eye drops, and they don't test mom to know whether she has gonorrhea. We assume like everyone has it, and the baby is given eye drops of silver nitrate and erythromycin to try to prevent this eye infection. Again, fairly easy to diagnose, right? We can observe a culture, right? Make a slide, stain this bacteria, and it is pretty characteristic, that little diplococcus shape. You can also do immunoassays, right? Looking for antibodies. Again, it's a bacteria, so we do have antibiotic treatments. Doxycycline is the common antibiotic here, but this is one of those ones where antibiotic resistance is developing, right? If you check, remember we talked about antibiotic resistance, and when you look at the CDC website, a lot of the diseases you'll see are actually STIs. Bulletin board right outside the lab, if you're bored, this coming week talks about different antibiotic resistant bacteria, and I believe one of the ones up there is gonorrhea. Okay, chlamydia. This one is the most common bacterial STI. So often just called chlamydia, right? But chlamydial urethritis is a good descriptive disease name here, right? So inflammation of the urethra caused by Chlamydia trachomatis. That's our organism here. This bacteria is exceptionally small. So it's strange in a lot of ways, right? So it actually doesn't have a cell wall. It has a cell membrane and an outer membrane, but no peptidoglycan cell wall. So you can't talk about which way it gram stains. And this particular bacteria is actually called an obligate energy parasite. So it doesn't have any of the metabolic machinery it needs to make ATP. And so it is going to need to be in a host cell in order to have energy. Humans are the only host. And then this picture, this isn't super important. This picture is pointing out that it kind of has two different phases during its life cycle. This reticulate, so-called reticulate body, notice that's inside of the host cell and stays in there. At this point, it's non-infectious, right? That would not transmit to another person. But then we see those reticulate bodies becoming these elementary bodies, right? Even smaller. And these are the ones that rupture out of the cell. This would be infectious. This is a weird critter. I mean, if you start looking at this, you're like, wait, well, is it a virus? Right? It has to be inside, right? It's an obligate parasite. It can't make energy on its own. Right? It's like a bunch of them replicating inside of a cell and busting out. Some of these things look really like a virus, but it is truly a bacteria, just not a standard one. Okay, so chlamydia or chlamydial urethritis it's interesting because sometimes it's also called non-gonococcal urethritis, right, or NGU. It is a gonorrhea-like disease transmitted by vaginal, anal, or oral sex. The incubation period here, 1 to 3 weeks. And this one's tough. It's many people are asymptomatic, right? It's often referred to as a silent disease. Something like 80 to 90% of people have no symptoms, right? Really, the only symptoms that develop here are due to the immune system's response to it. So the problem here, right, again, in females, 80% asymptomatic. Okay. The signs and symptoms you would see, things like vaginal discharge, inflammation of the cervix, maybe some burning pain when urinating are all pretty mild and could be mistaken for other things. Again, the problem here, chlamydia spreads up into the fallopian tubes, leads to salpingitis, again, this form of pelvic inflammatory disease. 40% of untreated chlamydia progresses to pelvic inflammatory disease. Okay. In fact, this chlamydia is considered the #1 cause of first trimester pregnancy-related deaths in the U.S. If you're dying in the first trimester of pregnancy, it's due to an ectopic pregnancy, right? So implanting in the fallopian tube, baby starts growing, expanding, there's not room, and that tube ruptures, and that will kill you, can kill you. And so, again, good reasons to try to avoid sexually transmitted infections. Even though they're not talked about, maybe it's not high on your list when considering a sexual partner. It should be. Okay, chlamydia. In males, painful urination, watery discharge, tingling sensation, again, can cause infertility. Again, mostly asymptomatic, right? They're not going to know. Okay. At birth, chlamydia ophthalmia, so past when the baby's coming out the birth canal, erythromycin will take care of this. You can also develop or pass on to baby, I suppose, this chlamydial pneumonia, so it gets in their airway during birth. Again, this one's actually not quite as easy to identify because it is so tiny. Here, typically, you're going to take a sample with a swab and do something like an antibody test or a DNA test. So not not going under like a staining procedure typically. What do we got here? Doxycycline, azithromycin, about 95% cure rate. So again, try to treat it early. Okay, genital warts. So this is the most common STI. This one's viral. So those other two, chlamydia was the most common bacterial, followed by gonorrhea. Okay, but okay, genital warts is caused by the human papillomavirus. So papilloma is referring to a wart. What is that? I don't know if that's French or that may be even older, that may be Latin or something. So of this virus, there's hundreds of different kind of strains of human papillomavirus. Here we're seeing our little, actually do I have another? Nope. A picture of our little virus here. It is an icosahedral virus. It's naked. It does not have an envelope. And it carries a double-stranded DNA. Now, the human papillomaviruses cause both common warts, right, that you might find on a hand, and genital warts that you're going to find near the genitalia. Common warts, right, so let's just talk about those for a little bit. The transmission is from contact with the virus, either on an infected individual. So you shake hands with this person, right? You could pick up that virus, or this can be transmitted through fomites. So this is one of those ones that you worry about, like the shower floor in the locker room, right? So plantar warts are considered common warts, and so that can spread, right? Without direct contact with the person, what you need is direct contact with the virus, right? And so that could come from a fomite. So treatment, right, of warts like these, you can get them frozen off. They use like liquid nitrogen, a little Q-tip, try to burn these off. You can use salicylic acid. So there are over-the-counter treatments where you buy a little bottle of acid and you keep putting acid on there. A newer treatment is called cantharidin, and this is, I think this is fascinating, right? They actually use a chemical that causes blistering, and that's going to kill the virus and make this wart fall off. What's interesting to me is that this is a form of biomimicry. So they found a beetle called the blister beetle, and this is what it uses. This is the chemical cantharidin that it uses as its defense. So if you aggravate this beetle, it's going to spray you with this blistering causing chemical. Anyway, okay, genital warts. It's like the same deal, right? But this time you're going to see the transmission coming from sexual contact. It still can lead to these warts. About 5.5 million Americans are infected with HPV every year. You do not have to have symptoms. You do not have to have obvious warts in order for this to be transmitted, right? Let's go here. Okay. Another thing to keep in mind, right, is that human papillomavirus has also been associated with cervical cancer. So what happens is, remember this virus, so it's a double-stranded DNA virus, right? It has to insert its DNA into your chromosome, start making messenger RNA to have itself replicated. So it looks like with this particular virus, when it inserts into the host chromosome, it is often inserting itself near a proto-oncogene, right? And so it can lead to the mutation or change, maybe the expression is a better way to say that, of the gene in the host chromosome. So Gardasil, someone talked about this in their vaccine paper, but Gardasil, notice what they've done here. So this is actually showing you the strains, right? Because again, there's hundreds of different strains of these viruses. But in the Gardasil vaccine, what they did is they chose different strains of human papillomavirus that are causing the most trouble. So strains 6 and 11 end up being responsible for something like 90% of the genital warts, right? And then strains 16 and 18 are responsible for around 70% of cervical cancers. So by including these 4 strains, the main target is the cervical cancer, but hey, genital warts, it doesn't sound like that much fun. And if you think about the treatment, you can do the same things. You can freeze them off. You can use acid to get them off. You can use that cantharidin, that blistering chemical, to get them off. No fun. Okay. And so Gardasil then is meant to protect people from ever contracting these strains, but only these strains of HPV. So you could be vaccinated, and you could develop other strains. When this first came out, it was fairly controversial because you're asking to vaccinate 11 to 12-year-olds against sexually transmitted infections. It's really important that they get the vaccine before they become sexually active, but that age was shocking, I suppose, to a lot of people. I don't want to say this, but you want to have this before you're sexually active. And so that's kind of how they chose that age group. They weren't suggesting that every 13-year-old go out and have sex. So, okay, so detection, right? Diagnosis, again, the genital warts can be fairly obvious. Otherwise, you pretty much are going to use things like a DNA test. Or what's really common, actually, this is what they're looking for in a pap smear. So this picture up on the right here is the cervix, and the pap smear, they're going in and scraping some of the cells and actually looking for cells that have obvious signs of viral damage. Remember when we talked about viruses, there were those different cytopathic effects? That's what we're looking for. So really to try to catch cancer early, but it also can tell us something about whether that cell has been infected by a virus in the past, right, by its behavior. So pap smears, looking for warts. You also can use DNA testing. Okay, just a couple more here. Herpes. So when we talk about herpes, we're really looking at the herpes simplex virus. And I pulled this graph because notice the family of viruses. So herpes viridae is actually the family of viruses. And over here is the herpes simplex virus. So these are the ones we're going to talk about. This is what causes common cold sores, right? And then also genital herpes. But notice some of these other ones, right, that are closely related. So Epstein-Barr virus is the one that causes mono. I believe this Kaposi sarcoma is a cancer that we see in people with HIV. And so I believe that's being triggered by this virus. Varicella, that's like pox. So like smallpox, chickenpox is going to fit under here. So it's a pretty common family of viruses, and we're just going to focus in on the herpes simplex virus. So basically 90% of Americans, by the time they reach the age of 18, have been exposed to the herpes simplex virus. Typically there's 2 different strains. So I'm going to abbreviate HSV, right? Herpes simplex virus. HSV1 is what leads to cold sores or fever blisters, whichever you call it. It's a fairly contagious virus. It leads to these sores or blisters around the mouth. This is what we would consider a primary infection. So you get this like tingling sensation and this small hard spot on the lip that breaks into these fluid-filled blisters. And typically these are self-limiting. So in about a week, they're going to go away. While that blister is out, that is when this is highly contagious. So really, from the time when there's a blister to that kind of dried, crusted over as it's attempting to heal, this is when it's really easy to spread it. So don't kiss, right, when these blisters are present. That said, you'd also say, well, 90% of Americans are already exposed, so maybe it doesn't make a difference. What becomes problematic, right, for people who and people who get cold sores repeatedly would tell you this, right? For a lot of people, they get a cold sore, right, when they first are infected with HSV1, and then they don't get them again, right? The immune system has produced memory, and it's not going to be a problem. For other individuals, and we don't understand necessarily why, so notice what's going on here. Here's the virus. Here's the virus in cells. Oh yeah, look at that. A virus infected a cell. The virus is replicating itself and bursting out, and it's finding other cells, and you're getting this blister. But the virus can also move into neurons. And in these neurons, it can lay latent, hidden, right? Just hanging out in the neuron, just waiting for some inopportune moment, right, to reactivate, return to the surface, and cause this rupture, this blister. And of course, the signals for when to do that are going to be things like stress. So you're worried about the big presentation you have at work. Fever, blister, that's exciting. Fever, right? So other illnesses could reactivate this. For some people, it's even menstruation, right? The changes in hormones can lead to a re-eruption of cold sores, sunburn, etc. So for some people, this is like a recurrent thing where they're getting these blisters multiple times a year. You can also get what's called herpes keratitis. This leads to scarring of the cornea. This is actually the major cause of blindness in the US. So particularly if you have an active cold sore, you can't touch it, right, and then be doing other things and then rub your eye, right? It can move through neurons, but it's much more common to kind of self-infect, and this can lead to blindness, so you don't want to do that. Now, genital herpes is primarily caused by HSV2, right? So a slightly different strain, likes the environment of the genitals more than your face. About 800,000 new cases a year in the US. Again, mostly HSV2. You can get HSV1 leading to genital herpes as well. Spread primarily by sexual contact. Again, does not survive very long outside of the body. It's not going to transmit by fomite, right? It's not on toilet seats. Signs and symptoms. There you have it, those blisters, right? So itching, reddening, swelling of a small area near the genitals, blisters, obviously. Those might rip open, kind of ulcerate, but it can be really mild. It can even go completely unnoticed, right? The blisters you probably notice, but some milder forms you might not. 50% of people that are infected only experience one outbreak in their lifetime. Right? The other 50%, just like with cold sores, it can go latent inside of nerve cells and has the same triggers as cold sores, right? To have these reoccurrent outbreaks of blisters. Herpes can be passed to a baby, right? Before I go here. So the virus is reactivated with stress. Sunburn may not be a trigger here. So you get recurrent infections. The average is 3 to 8 times a year. That sounds pretty annoying. The active herpes lesions, right? So when these blisters are actually happening, the active lesions are highly infectious. It is possible to spread this to other people when you have no active lesions, right? It's still transmissible when there's no signs or symptoms, but when there are these blisters, it's highly infectious, right? So the other thing with herpes is because you do have like this open blistering of the skin, you are at higher risk for transmitting or contracting other STIs, right? Because there's going to be a break in the skin there. There are treatments. These are basically antivirals. There have been commercials for acyclovir, so that might be one you know about, really trying to decrease the number of flare-ups and then decrease the chance of transmitting this to partners. Neonatal herpes, right? So this can pass on to the newborn during labor and delivery. even with treatment, this can be passed on. So this poor little baby here with these blisters all over doesn't look comfortable, but really the problem here is what goes on in the brain. Okay, and so passing herpes on to baby does lead to things like delayed mental development, blindness, seizures. And so herpes is one where if we know mom is positive for herpes, they're going to want to deliver via C-section to try to avoid, because this isn't crossing the placenta, this is being passed during childbirth. And so that can be, at least a lot of that can be prevented by delivering by C-section. So again, other good reasons to know, right, if you have these things. So HIV, AIDS. So AIDS, the acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, is caused by HIV, human immunodeficiency virus. This is a so this is obviously a really important and scary sexually transmitted infection. It's one that's fairly new to the scene, and it probably doesn't seem like it to us, right? Because the first set of reported symptoms in the US was in the early 1980s. 1981 was the first time we saw it here. By 1983, researchers figured out it was a virus, and by 1986, the virus was named. So here's the thing. For you and I, HIV has always been here. But I was actually talking to a coworker who's in her 50s, and she was saying, yeah, like, you know, I remember when this was the pandemic, right? This was the scary disease. There's all of a sudden there's people that are getting this disease. We don't know what's causing it, but their immune system starts failing and they're dying from these different crazy things. And it's kind of interesting to parallel it to our current pandemic. And I just think even about that timeline, right? So 1981 was when we first noticed people with symptoms. And it took till 1986 to name the virus. Think about the virus that we're dealing with now, right? Within like a month or two of people noticing a cluster of basically like pneumonia-like diseases, the entire genome was categorized and we really knew what we were dealing with, right? And we're talking about trying to have a vaccine like within a year. So this is pretty wild. Anyway, but yeah, it must have been a really scary time, right? Like, didn't know how it was spread, didn't know, right, for 2 years that it was even a virus. We just knew that people were getting sick and dying. So HIV is considered a retrovirus. So it has single-stranded RNA here in the center, and then it is going to use this enzyme reverse transcriptase to make DNA that the host cell can read. Little enveloped virus here. So when this is not the world's best picture, right? But here's your single-stranded RNA, reverse transcriptase rewrites that into DNA. The DNA can enter the nucleus of the host cell, insert itself in the chromosome, and then as messenger RNA copies start getting built, we can make new copies of the virus. This virus only infects, I think we've talked about this, it only infects helper T cells, right? So it, I want to say it actually uses that CD4 protein on the helper T cells as like as a docking site or something like that. So HIV, right? HIV leads to AIDS. So here's the weird thing, right? So HIV is the virus that causes AIDS. But when we talk about the diseases that this virus causes, we'll talk about HIV also as the disease, right? And so it occurs in a few different stages. So early on, after contracting HIV, many people are asymptomatic. So the first stage 1 of this disease, many people are asymptomatic. Some people get like a flu-like illness, but you wouldn't necessarily know that you had it. But during this time, the immune system is attempting to fight off this virus, and you will produce antibodies which is going to be how this is actually identified, right? The presence of antibodies would tell you that you have been exposed or have HIV. But this can take a while, right? We know that there's an incubation period for these viruses till our immune system actually catches on, and then we have to get sick and we have to mount this immune response. So you can't get tested for HIV like the day after unprotected sex with someone. This is going to be months before you would know if you were HIV positive. Disease then moves into stage 2. This can be years later. I think on average it's like 6 to 8 years later that people start seeing early signs of immunodeficiency. There's no major disease, but maybe you're, getting sick a little bit more often, those sorts of things. Stage 3, where am I? There we go. Stage 3 then is actually AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. This is when the virus has ramped up enough, it has reproduced itself enough to really be working on eliminating the immune system. Again, it's the helper T cells. So normally in a cubic millimeter of blood, right, a little tiny blood sample, you should have 1,000 helper T cells. We're looking at there being less than 200. That's when they're going to come up with the diagnosis of AIDS, right, that you've moved into this third stage. The virus is replicating super rapidly at this point, billions of new viruses each day. And so then the problem is, and that's what they're pointing out here, is that without those helper T cells, without the immune system functioning, you're going to start developing lots of different opportunistic infections, certain cancers that you would not see in people who don't have AIDS. And so this is the stuff in the 1980s where they started noticing, like, why are all these people in San Francisco, right, suddenly dying of this weird cancer that we don't see elsewhere, this Kaposi sarcoma. It's because it's caused by a virus that our immune system would normally catch. And these their immune system has been destroyed. And so they're pointing out, higher rates of things like meningitis, pneumocystic pneumonia is really common. That's going to be caused by a fungus. We already mentioned the fact that tuberculosis is a death sentence for someone with AIDS. Really high mortality rate there. Again, different cancers showing up, lots of GI tract symptoms. So the transmission, right, this is a sexually transmitted infection, typically through either vaginal or anal intercourse, not super transmissible, is my understanding anyway, through oral sex. Contaminated needles, again, don't share needles. Other STDs, right, like we mentioned, having open sores, things like herpes, make a person more susceptible to contracting HIV. This is a virus that can move across the placenta, infecting the baby. It can also be transmitted during birth, and it can also move across the baby through breast milk. So an HIV positive woman is going to have to meet with doctors and come up with a plan really to try to not have a baby born who's already infected with HIV. Again, testing, you may not be able to tell that you have HIV until you develop antibodies, and this can be 3+ months later. There are treatments. So it's interesting, HIV/AIDS has moved from essentially a death sentence into kind of a chronic disease. But what we'll see is that it requires kind of an ever-changing cocktail of drugs. So I thought this was really interesting. So this is a new drug called 3TC, and we're looking at the percent of HIV that's resistant to that drug, right? It's not paying attention to that drug. And so in this study, right, we have 3 patients, and all of the HIV gets killed by 3TC when they first start receiving the drug. But by 2 months later, by 8 weeks, all 3 of them, all of their virus is completely resistant to this drug. And so this has really been the course of things, constantly trying to like tweak the drugs, change the cocktail. But, which sounds like a total pain in the butt, but in your book quotes, HIV is a chronic disease now. It's like diabetes or high blood pressure. As long as you manage it, you should expect to live a long, healthy life. And that's a really dramatic change from 40 years ago when this was first discovered in the US. So kind of a neat, it'd be great if we had a vaccine, but really a neat success story as far as treating this was an emerging infectious disease, right, that moved to humans probably from apes not that long ago. Anyway, okay. Last thing I'll say, again, prevention-wise, avoiding risky behavior. They are still researching vaccines, but it is problematic with how quickly it mutates, right? So you see how it's gaining that resistance to drugs. It's kind of a moving target for vaccination as well. They've also developed, totally blanking, they've developed prophylactic drugs. So if someone is HIV positive and they are going to have a new partner, there's actually drugs that partner can take that dramatically reduces the chance that they'd become infected with HIV. So, all right, sexually transmitted infections. We can talk about those a little more in class, but I hope you enjoyed this recording and the gnarly pictures. I know you have more of those in your book. But a really important set of diseases. Again, 4 out of the top 10 infectious diseases in the US are sexually transmitted infections. And absolutely, we see huge numbers of infections, primarily in the upper teens, early 20s. So, all right, see you soon.